Imagine for a moment losing everything you've built in your life in a single instant. Your family, your possessions, your health, and even the support of the people you love and trust most. Seems impossible to bear, right? But that was the reality for a man named Job, whose story, told thousands of years ago, still resonates as one of the most profound examples of perseverance, resilience, and unwavering faith in the face of chaos and extreme suffering. Job's story is one of the oldest and most impactful texts ever recorded, and its message transcends time, offering valuable insights into human nature, pain, and the search for meaning in the midst of adversity. Job was a prosperous, upright, and God-fearing man who lived a full and blessed life. He had a loving family, abundant wealth, and a reputation for justice and goodness. However, in a short amount of time, he lost everything: his children, his property, his health, and even the respect of his friends and those around him. Job's pain was so deep that he even questioned the very meaning of his existence. But what makes Job's story so fascinating isn't just the suffering he endured, but how he dealt with those devastating losses. Instead of giving in to despair or rebellion, Job chose to maintain his integrity and his faith even when everything around him seemed to crumble. He didn't have answers for why he was suffering so much, but he clung to the belief that even in the darkest circumstances, there was a greater purpose he couldn't understand. Today, we're going to dive deep into Job's journey, exploring every aspect of his story and reflecting on the lessons we can learn from it. We'll analyze how he found the strength to keep going, even when every door seemed closed and hope seemed distant. More than that, we'll explore how you can apply these teachings in your own life, especially when tough times hit and you're tempted to give up. Job's story teaches us that life isn't always fair and that suffering is an inescapable part of the human condition. However, it also shows us that even in the most desperate situations, it's possible to find meaning and an inner strength that allows us to keep moving forward. Job's faith wasn't blind or naive. It was a faith that questioned, that struggled, and that in the end was renewed. Throughout this exploration, we'll reflect on how we can cultivate that same resilience in our own lives. How can we find hope when all seems lost? How can we maintain our integrity and our faith even when circumstances pressure us to abandon them? And finally, how can we transform our own stories of pain into testimonies of overcoming and growth? Job's journey is an invitation to look beyond our immediate circumstances and see a bigger picture. It's a reminder that even in the darkest nights, there's a light that can guide us if we're willing to look for it. So, get ready to embark on this inspiring journey and discover how the story of a man who lost everything can teach us how to find what really matters. Job was a man of integrity, upright and God-fearing, whose life was an example of prosperity and blessings. He not only enjoyed material wealth, but also had a large and loving family, consisting of 7 sons and 3 daughters, as well as a large number of servants and flocks that placed him among the wealthiest men of his time. His reputation was impeccable. He was known for his justice, generosity, and devotion to God. Job was, in every sense, a man who lived a full and blessed life, surrounded by everything that could be considered success and happiness. However, in an instant, everything changed. Job's life was turned upside down by a series of devastating tragedies that befell him quickly and relentlessly. First, he lost all his material possessions. His flocks were stolen or destroyed, his servants were killed, and his properties were reduced to nothing. Then came the most painful news of all. His children, who were gathered at the house of one of their brothers, died when a strong wind knocked the house down on them. To complete the picture of desolation, Job was struck by a terrible disease that covered his body with painful sores, leaving him in constant agony. Amidst so much pain and despair, even his wife, who shared his suffering, went so far as to say, "Curse God and die." These words, although harsh, reflected the depth of the anguish they both felt. She saw Job's suffering as unbearable and in a moment of weakness, suggested that he abandon his faith and end his own life. However, Job didn't give up. He didn't deny his pain, nor did he try to hide his suffering. On the contrary, he questioned, cried, and expressed his anguish in a sincere and profound way. He even questioned God's justice and cried out for answers, but at no point did he abandon his faith. And this is where we find the first big lesson from Job's story. Persevering doesn't mean not feeling pain. Job shows us that it's deeply human to question, to cry, and to feel the crushing weight of circumstances. The pain he experienced wasn't minimized or ignored. On the contrary, it was lived in its fullness. Job wasn't a superhero immune to suffering. He was an ordinary man with real and deep emotions who faced unimaginable losses. However, what sets him apart is that he didn't allow the pain to define the end of his story. True perseverance, as demonstrated by Job, isn't in the absence of pain, but in the ability to keep moving forward despite it. It's the decision not to allow suffering to have the final word. Job teaches us that it's possible to question, to lament, and even to argue with God without losing the essence of faith. His story reminds us that faith isn't a denial of reality, but a choice to trust in something bigger, even when reality seems unbearable. This lesson is deeply relevant to all of us, especially when we face moments of crisis, loss, or despair. How often do we feel pressured to hide our pain, to pretend that everything is okay, or to believe that faith requires a passive and silent acceptance of suffering? Job shows us that it's not like that. He teaches us that true faith is the one that faces the pain head-on, that recognizes it and expresses it, but that, at the same time, refuses to be consumed by it. So when tough times come knocking at your door, remember Job. Remember that it's okay to feel, to cry, and to question. But above all, remember that perseverance is in not allowing the pain to define your destiny. Like Job, you can choose to trust that even in the darkest nights, there's a light that can guide you, and that your story isn't over yet. Pain may be a chapter, but it doesn't have to be the end of the book. Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, arrived with the intention of comforting him in his suffering. However, as the conversations unfolded, their words turned into veiled accusations. They tried to convince Job that his suffering was somehow his own fault. To them, the logic was simple. If Job was going through such adversity, he must have committed some serious sin or failed in his devotion to God. After all, in their minds, suffering was always a direct consequence of wrongdoing. Who has ever perished being innocent? They questioned. They believed that divine justice operated in a linear fashion. The righteous are blessed and the wicked are punished. Therefore, if Job was suffering, he certainly had done something to deserve it. How often do we hear this kind of talk in our own lives, right? When we face difficulties, losses, or crises, it's common for the people around us, often with good intentions, to try to find a rational explanation for our suffering. You must have done something wrong to be going through this, they say. Or, there must be a lesson in all this, something you need to learn. These words, although they may come from a place of concern, often end up increasing the weight of the pain, as they suggest that suffering is a punishment or a direct consequence of our actions. However, Job knew that life isn't always fair. He understood that suffering can't always be explained by a simple equation of cause and effect. He didn't deny that there might be lessons to be learned in the midst of pain, but he refused to accept that his suffering was just a punishment for some hidden mistake. Instead, Job chose to believe that, even in the midst of the most violent storm, there was a greater purpose that he couldn't understand. He didn't have all the answers, but he trusted that God was still in control, even when everything around him seemed chaotic and meaningless. And this is the second big lesson that Job's story teaches us. Persevering is trusting that there's a purpose, even when we can't see it. Job didn't have a clear view of what was happening or why there was so much suffering. He didn't know that behind the scenes there was a dialogue between God and Satan that had put his faith to the test. He didn't have access to the full picture. However, he chose to trust that even in the darkness, there was a hand guiding the course of his life. This lesson is deeply challenging, especially in a world where we're used to looking for quick answers and immediate solutions. We want to understand the why of everything. We want to know the reason for every pain, every loss, every challenge. But the truth is that we don't always have that clarity. Sometimes the purpose behind suffering is only revealed with time, or maybe it will never be fully understood in this life. And that's where faith comes in. Job shows us that faith isn't a denial of reality or an escape from difficult questions. On the contrary, faith is the decision to trust that even when we don't understand, there's a greater purpose in action. It's believing that God is working even when everything seems to be falling apart. It's choosing to look beyond the immediate circumstances and trust that in the end, all things work together for the good of those who love God. This trust doesn't eliminate the pain, but it gives meaning to it. Job didn't stop suffering because he decided to trust in God. His wounds continued to hurt, his loss continued to be deeply felt, and his questions continued without immediate answers. However, he found a solid foundation to continue persevering, the certainty that God was greater than his suffering and that somehow all of that was part of a bigger plan. For us, this lesson is an invitation to embrace faith even when life seems unfair or incomprehensible. It's a reminder that we don't always need to have all the answers to keep walking. Sometimes perseverance is in simply trusting that even when we can't see the full picture, there's an artist working on every detail of our story. So, when you find yourself in the midst of a storm, remember Job. Remember that it's okay to question, to cry, and to feel the pain. But it's also possible to choose to trust that there's a greater purpose in action. Even when we can't see it, we can rest in the certainty that God is still in control and that He is working in all things for our good and for His glory. That's the essence of true perseverance. At the end of his journey of suffering and questioning, Job was restored. His unwavering faith and his perseverance in the face of adversity were rewarded, but not in the way that he or any of his friends could have imagined. Job's restoration wasn't just material, although he recovered twice as much as he had lost. His flocks, his properties, and even his family with the birth of new children. However, the true restoration was much deeper and more meaningful. Job found a new understanding of who God was and of his own place in the world. He came out of the experience with an expanded view of divine sovereignty and of the complexity of life, which goes far beyond simplistic explanations and ready-made formulas. Throughout his suffering, Job had cried out for answers. He wanted to understand the why of everything that was happening. He questioned God's justice, debated with his friends, and expressed his anguish in a sincere and profound way. However, when God finally answered, He didn't give Job a detailed explanation of the reason for his suffering. Instead, God spoke to Job from a whirlwind, asking a series of rhetorical questions that highlighted His infinite wisdom and His creative power. "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth?" God asked. He described the complexity of the universe, the majesty of creation, and the order that sustains all things. And in doing so, God showed Job that there are mysteries that go beyond human understanding. This revelation was transformative for Job. He realized that although he didn't have all the answers, he could trust in God's wisdom and goodness. He understood that his vision was limited, but that God was in control of all things. And this understanding brought a peace that no human explanation could offer. Job answered God with humility, saying, "I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you." In other words, Job had undergone an inner transformation. He wasn't the same man who had started the journey. His faith had been refined by the fire of suffering, and he emerged with a deeper and more authentic connection with God. And this is the final lesson that Job's story teaches us. Persevering is believing that even if the road is difficult, the story isn't over yet. Job shows us that regardless of what we're facing, there's hope, and that sometimes the greatest victory isn't the change of external circumstances, but the transformation that happens within us. Job's suffering wasn't in vain. He not only recovered what he had lost, but also gained a new perspective on life, on God, and on himself. This lesson is deeply relevant to all of us. How often do we find ourselves in situations where it feels like the suffering will never end, where circumstances seem unbearable and the answers we seek never come? In those moments, it's easy to lose hope and believe that the story is over. But the story of Job reminds us that even in the darkest times, God is working. He may be shaping our character, strengthening our faith, or preparing us for something greater that we cannot yet see. Perseverance, therefore, isn't just about holding on until things get better. It's about believing that even if the road is difficult, there's a purpose in everything we're going through. It's about trusting that God is in control, even when we don't understand what's happening. And it's about allowing suffering to transform us, making us wiser, more compassionate, and closer to Him. Job teaches us that true victory isn't always in changing our circumstances, but in the change that happens within us. He not only recovered what he had lost, but he also became a stronger, humbler, and more connected person to God. And that's the greatest reward we can hope for, the transformation that prepares us to live a fuller, more meaningful life, regardless of what the future holds. So, when you find yourself in the middle of a storm, remember Job. Remember that the story isn't over yet. Remember that there is hope even when everything seems lost. And above all, remember that the greatest victory may not be the change in the circumstances around you, but the transformation that happens within you. That's the essence of true perseverance. So, if you're going through a difficult time, one of those periods where it feels like the ground is opening up beneath your feet and all the certainties you had are crumbling, remember Job's journey. The story of this man who faced devastating losses and almost unbearable pain is not just an ancient account, but a beacon of hope for all of us who, at some point, find ourselves facing challenges that seem greater than our strength. Job's journey teaches us that even in the darkest situations, there are lessons to be learned, strengths to be discovered, and above all, hope to be found. First, allow yourself to feel the pain. Job did not deny his suffering. He didn't try to hide his tears or pretend that everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. He cried, lamented, questioned, and expressed his anguish in a sincere and profound way. And this shows us that it's human to feel pain. There is no shame in admitting that we are suffering, that we are confused, or that we are tired. Pain is a natural response to losses and adversities, and trying to ignore it or suppress it only makes it heavier. So if you're going through a difficult time, give yourself permission to feel. Cry if you need to cry, scream if you need to scream, question if you need to question. Pain is not a sign of weakness, but an expression of the depth of what you are experiencing. However, while it's important to feel the pain, it's equally crucial not to let it define you. Job teaches us that even in the midst of suffering, we can choose how to respond to it. He did not allow the pain to consume him or lead him to abandon his integrity and his faith. Instead, he chose to trust that even when he couldn't understand what was happening, there was a greater purpose at work. This trust didn't eliminate his pain, but it gave him the strength needed to continue persevering. So, if you're facing a storm in your life, remember that pain can be a chapter of your story, but it doesn't have to be the end of the book. You can choose not to be defined by what you're going through, but rather by what you decide to do with it. Trust that there is a purpose, even if you can't see it now. One of the most powerful lessons from Job's story is that we don't always understand the why of things. Job never knew during his ordeal that there was a dialogue between God and Satan that had put his faith to the test. He didn't have access to the full picture. However, he chose to trust that even in the darkness, there was a hand guiding the course of his life. This trust wasn't naive or blind. It was a conscious choice to believe that God was in control, even when everything seemed chaotic and meaningless. For us, this lesson is an invitation to embrace faith even when life seems unfair or incomprehensible. It's a reminder that we don't always need to have all the answers to keep walking. Sometimes perseverance is simply trusting that even when we can't see the whole picture, there is a greater purpose at work. And above all, persevere. Job's story shows us that the storm can be strong, but it is not eternal. No matter how difficult the moment you are facing, it will not last forever. Job faced unimaginable losses and deep pain, but he didn't give up. He continued persevering, even when everything around him seemed to crumble. And in the end, he was restored. His faith and his perseverance were rewarded, not only with the restitution of everything he had lost, but with a new understanding of who God was and of his own place in the world. He came out of the experience transformed, with a deeper faith and a more authentic connection with the divine. So, if you're going through a difficult time, remember that the storm can be strong, but it is not eternal. Just like Job, you too can find the light at the end of the tunnel. It may take time, and the path may be painful, but there is hope, there is a purpose, and there is a strength within you that can only be discovered when you choose to persevere. Job's journey reminds us that even in the darkest nights, there is a light that can guide us, and that our story is not over yet. So, take a deep breath, trust, and keep walking. Because just like Job, you too can emerge from this storm stronger, wiser, and closer to what really matters.